Hey everyone, LöKii here. It's about 9:15 Monday morning, and today we're going to be talking about my primitive root diffuser. Okay, so what is a primitive root diffuser? A primitive root diffuser uses a grid of typically wooden posts, each with a different height, to obtain a different reflection delay time. The heights of the posts are chosen according to successive powers of a primitive root g modulo n, a prime number. There's a bunch of mathematical gibberish, meaning that sound hits this, reflects in a different direction, so that instead of having a bare wall where the sound goes and bounces straight back at you, it is reflected off of this device into a bunch of different directions, loses a bunch of energy, and by the time it finally gets back to you, it's much quieter. And so when you're listening to your reference monitors, you mainly only hear your reference monitors and not a large array of reflections in your room, because the reflections have been dispersed away from you or diffused. Now, how do we build this? What does it do? How does this even work? So there's a website here, oliverprime.com. And they have, you go to this website and it will have your lowest frequency range, highest frequency range, a prime number, a primitive root, number of columns, and number of rows. And this uses a patented script to calculate your two-dimensional primitive root diffuser so that you can build your own. So you can enter parameters that are specific to you, and then you can build it in your room. So this is how I did mine, and this is how it works. So we can go to examples. So here we have P, which is the number of columns that there will be in your diffuser. PR, which is the primitive root. The aspect ratio is super important here. Aspect ratio, everyone knows what that is. In my case, I wanted one that was about 1.6 aspect ratio because I wanted something that would fit on my back wall. And then here, this is also super important, the grid size. So number of columns times number of rows. So for me, I wanted to make the least number of pieces possible while maintaining a good aspect ratio. And so the problem is the bigger the grid gets, the more pieces you have to make. And the more pieces you have to make, the longer it takes and the more tedious it is. So I either did 571 or 523. And I actually don't remember. So let's just do 523 for all intents and purposes. And so if you're using a 1 by 1 inch square piece, that means that your total grid size would be 29 inches by 18 inches. And you would have 523 total pieces. So let's calculate what that would actually look like on your room. So we go here to calculate, and now here number is 523. The PR is 2, and then 29 by 18 is the grid size. So PR, so 2, and then it's 29 columns by 18 rows. Calculate. Okay, so this is what we've been given. Now, it gives us our exact layout of what pieces go where on the grid, and this is referring to length of piece or piece height in centimeters. So you can change that. You can do 2 centimeters or 3 or whatever you want. It's easy to cut pieces that are 1 centimeter, so centimeter is a pretty good way to do it. Now, there's something that's really important here. The maximum height of these wells, the 34 centimeters is the maximum height here. That is how far off the wall your diffuser will protrude. So it's important in your room to figure out how far you want it to protrude off, because if it's sticking out 2 feet off your wall, that's completely useless. The problem is the effectiveness of the, I'm just hitting the mic. The effectiveness of the PRD is tied to the length of the wood. So here we have the frequency range. Now low frequency waves are quite long, so they need longer pieces of wood to absorb the entire wave and send it in a different direction. Doesn't actually absorb it. It absorbs it a little bit, but it reflects it. So in my room, 34 inches was just not going to cut it. That's way too long. So I believe I used 950 hertz. Okay, so let's set this to 950. We'll leave that at 5,000, and then we'll calculate. And so now our highest piece is 18 centimeters, which is about 7.5 inches, which worked a lot better for my room. And so although you don't get as much frequency response, 950 hertz is still reasonable enough. Like, we're getting claps, we're getting some vocal stuff in here. It's not terrible. It's not ideal, but it's not terrible. Ideally, you have a room that's longer than mine. Because you're deflecting sound in different directions, the longer and the more space that the sound has to be put in other places, the more effective it will be. Heavy dampening is really useful in making this effective because you're sending the sound into more dampening and more dampening and more dampening absorption. So the reflections will come back weaker. If you were reflecting these into just a blank wall, then you would more be just delaying the signal as opposed to reducing the strength of the signal as well. But that's more of a side and more of a room treatment thing. So how do you actually build this thing? So you cut all your pieces of wood. You can use 1x1 stock. I stripped 2x4s and 2x6s because it's what I had left over after construction. And you cut them all into the dimensions allocated by this formula. So down here, for the one I used, you can see I had 32 1 centimeter pieces, 32 2, 31 3, 32 4, etc., all the way down. And so you can pre-cut all of these just using a table saw, and then you sand them all down so they're nice and smooth and that they'll all fit together. The main thing to notice, you want them all to be the same size. You want them all to be 1x1 or 1.5 by 1.5 or whatever dimension you're using. You want them all to be square and the same size, because when you're gluing them together, they won't fit into a nice clean grid if you don't do that. The other thing I would highly recommend is you want to try and keep them straight. I did a terrible job, but you want all the pieces as straight as possible as you're going down the grid to maintain that form. Where I made the biggest error is not all of my pieces were correctly exactly 1x1. I would recommend using a planer or some sort of other way to make sure that your pieces are in fact square. So as we're going through, you follow your grid allocations. So here the first slot is 0, 7, 9, 8, 8. So you would use a 0 centimeter, a 7 centimeter, 9, and 8, and you put them all in. And just some wood glue does it. You can see I use Tight Bond. That's pretty standard. And so you keep going along. I put it on the back of a 1/2-inch piece of plywood. I would recommend using plywood over something like SPF or particle board. It'll just hold together better. Just make sure it's a straight piece. So this took a reasonable amount of time. You know, as you're going through, it's kind of tedious, but it starts to really come together, and then in the end you're left with something really cool. So to cut around the edge, I used a router. Just router it all off. My dad gave me a hand with that. He's pretty handy. And then to mount it on the wall, it's a French cleat. So it's just, you know, a piece of 1x4 that's sanded, put a ledge in, you put your 1x4 on the wall, and then mount it to that. And then this is what it looks like mounted. And this is before I had any of the paneling up inside the studio. I just finished painting and everything and putting the cloud on. So I'll do another close-up here so you can see exactly what's going on. You can see that each slot is unique, and it actually follows that formula exactly to what was listed on that graph that I showed you guys. Normally a standard wallet just bounces off, comes back, but as it goes here, gets reflected, loses a bit of power, goes through the panel, loses power, hits the wall, loses power, comes back out of the panel, loses power, and then comes back here, and by the time it hits my ear, it's lost so much power that it's quite a bit quieter than what's coming out of the speakers. And that way you don't really hear those reflections, and all you're hearing is what's coming out of the speakers. And that is what creates a really nice sounding room. But again, like I said, this is a bit small of a room for this, but it looks really cool. And after testing it with a bunch of frequency sweeps and referencing records, I think I got away with it. And I also worked really hard making it, so I kind of wanted to just use it and see if it worked. I think a big part of why it worked in this room too is the cloud. With the cloud, when it bounces off here and goes to the ceiling, the cloud actually has quite a bit of noise dampening effect. It's quite quiet, so I think that helped a lot with me getting away with this diffuser. So that's how you make a PRD diffuser. Sorry, PRD primitive root diffuser. They're really fun. Takes a lot of work, but I think it's pretty rewarding, and they look really cool. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe. All of the links will be in the bottom, all of the references. And follow me on Twitch, follow the channel. Thanks for watching, thanks for the support. And I got lots more videos coming, so I hope you guys enjoy.